We'll start where we left off on Daf Pei Tes Amid Beis. The Mishnah is actually on the bottom of Pei Tes Amid Aleph, and we're talking about Minchas Nesachim, which are the Nesachim that accompany a carbon zevach. And the Mishnah establishes that you're allowed to mix the Nesachim of Parim with the Nesachim of Elim. And the reason for that is because they all have the same ratio of flour and oil, and that is the ratio of 2 lugim of oil for an isaron of soles. That's true based on a Mishnah earlier in the Masechta. Minchas Nesachim for Parim has 3 isronos of soles, and therefore we multiply 2 lugim of shemen by 3, and we get 6 lugim of shemen. Now, in the case of the Minchas Nesachim of an ayil, there it's 2 isronos of flour, and it's going to be 4 lugim of shemen. So the ratio remains the same. The exception to the rule is a keves. In the case of a keves, there are 3 isronim of oil for 1 single isaron of flour. So therefore, the Mishnah implies that you can only mix harim with elim, but not with kvasim. The Mishnah continues and establishes that niskei kvasim b'niskei kvasim, if you're combining the nesachim of a keves with the nesachim of another keves, then shel yachid b'shel tzibur, if, for example, you would mix a keves of a yachid, let's say a private carbon that he brought, as opposed to a keves of the tzibur, like, for example, shnei kvasim of shvuas. And the Mishnah continues on the top of Pei Tes Amid Beis, shel yom b'shel emesh, if he has a carbon on one day, he's allowed to bring the nesachim 10 days later, and if the nesach has not been sanctified in a klishares, then you could even wait and delay bringing the nesachim for 10 days because there's no psul of lina. Aval ein ma'arvin niskei kvasim v'niskei parim v'elim. We cannot mix the nesachim of these 2 because they have different ratios of shemen and soles. So, for example, in the case of the mincha of parim or elim, then the mincha is thick and dry because you're only using 2 lugim of shemen for an isaron of soles. But in the case of a keves, there you're requiring 3 lugim of oil for 1 single isaron of flour. So it's 3 lugim, and therefore it's much more loose and liquidy. And if you were to mix these 2 kinds of menachos, the mincha of the par or the ayil would absorb some of the extra oil because we said in the case of a keves, you're going to have 3 lugim of oil as opposed to the 2 lugim in a parim and elim, and the mincha of the keves would be lacking oil, whereas the mincha of the par or the aisle would have excessive oil. So that we cannot do. V'imbolam elu b'fnei atzmon ve'elu b'fnei atzmon v'nisarvu ksherim. If, on the other hand, after you've mixed all the ingredients together separately, so for example, you mix the lugim of shemen with the isaron of the soles, and you mix them each one separately, and then he combined them together, and that's called nisarvu in the lashon of Mishnah. After he had mixed them and prepared them, now there was a tarovas, a mixture, then ksherim im ad shelo bolal posel. But if they became mixed up before he combined the shemen with the soles, then it's invalid. It's possible. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the next part of the Mishnah. Hakeves haboima omer afal bishim nechaso kfula lo hayu nechasav kfulin. You would have thought that since the Torah requires a double amount of soles in the case of the keves haba im haomer, then likewise you should double the amount of the nesachim, which means in this case yayin or the oil. No, the Mishnah says lo nesachim kfulin. So in the case of a keves haba im haomer, then the halacha would be that although it has a double amount of flour and soles, its nesachim are the same as any other keves, a quarter of a hin of oil and a quarter of a hin of yayin. And now we look at the Gemara. The Gemara says, Raminu, I have a brisa that seems to contradict our Mishnah. And the brisa darshans a pasuk which appears at the beginning of Vayikra in Perek Gimel, Viktiro, and the vav of Viktiro at the end of the word is a mute. Shelo ya'arev chalavim b'chalavim. That we don't mix that part which requires haktorah gam mizbeach from one carbon with that part that requires haktorah called chalavim of a different carbon. And yet in the Mishnah that we just learned with regard to Nesachim, we said that ma'arvim niskei parim b'niskei elim. Obviously you're talking about two different karbanos. And how could you mix them together when the Torah says viktiro, shelo ya'arev? Omar Rabbi Yochanan, im nisarvu ka'omar. We misunderstood the Mishnah. When the Mishnah says ma'arvin, it sounds like lechatchila you're allowed to mix the nesachim from one carbon to the other. No. That's not what the Mishnah means. The Mishnah means b'di'eved, if the nesachim of, let's say, a par got mixed up with the yayin of the nesachim of a aisle, then it's kosher. And we could be makriv on the mizbeach. But lechatchila, we apply the principle of shalo yehei ma'arev chalav v'chalav. And the Gemara now, based on its careful reading of the structure of the Mishnah, is going to reject this pshat of Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Because if you take a look, the Mishnah, after establishing ma'arvim, then goes on to establish ein ma'arvim, right? In the case of kvasim and elim or parim. Ihachi, if according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, even the reisha of the Mishnah, where you're mixing nesachim of elim with nesachim of parim, it's only b'di'evet that it's okay, but l'chatchila we're not allowed to make that mixture, is then ein ma'arvin niskei kvasim v'nichsei par v'elim, it would imply that afilu nisarvu nami lo. Right? If the first case is, well, we'll validate it b'di'evet, then the second case is going to have to be the ein ma'arvim in contrast, that b'di'evet is possible. But that can't be because let's read the next part of the Mishnah. The next part of the Mishnah says, Haktani Seifa, Klolon, Bololon, Elu bifnei atzmam ve'elu bifnei atzmam isarvu ksherim. Only in this case, where he combined the ingredients together first, before the tarovis, before the mixture, then it's kosher. Michlal, we can understand from that the reishal chatchila ka'amar, that in the first case, it's only lechatchila. So that means if you mixed up the yayin l'nisachim of kvasim together with the others, whether it be with a par or whether it be with an ayil, then obviously the halacha would be from the diuk in the Mishnah that it's kosher. So now we don't know, according to Rabbi Yochanan, what's the difference between the reisha and he mixes a niskei, let's say, parim with parim, or niskei elim with elim, or the combination thereof, because the ingredients and the ratio is always the same, then you're telling me that that's the case that's only b'di'evet kosher, which would imply that in the case of the seifa, meaning with kvasim mixed up with the other types, then it would be possible even b'di'evet. That's not so, because we medayik from the seifa that in the previous case, meaning this in kvasim case, then b'di'evet it would be kosher. In a word, it just doesn't work out. Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of the ratio of the Mishnah cannot be substantiated. Omar Abaye, therefore Abaye reinterprets the Mishnah in the light of Rabbi Yochanan. Hachikamer, this is what the Mishnah has in mind. Ma'arvim yenam im nisarvu sultan vishamna. So now we're talking about a taroves of soles and shemen. And we're saying the following, that if you mixed up the soles and the shemen, and they became mixed together, so therefore what our Mishnah is focused on when it uses the word nisachim is not the soles and the shemen of the mincha, that those ingredients of the mincha, but purely the yayin. And therefore, when we go back to the brisa and the pasuk v'hiktiro shelo ya'arve halavim v'chalavim, that's only referring to the mixture of soles and shemen of different menachos. But mixing together with the yayin of different nisachim, of different karbanos, is mutter even lechatchila. So therefore, let's read the Mishnah according to Abayi's interpretation. In the resh of the Mishnah, you're allowed to mix together the wine of nisachim of both a par and an ayil. However, that's only because, says Abaye, the flour and oil portions had already become mixed prior to the time of the mixture of the nisachim. And Rashi points out here that otherwise the Rabbanan would not allow you to mix these two nisachim together of their wine, because then he might mix the flour and the oil. And with regard to mixing the flour and the oil, we have the pasuk vehiktiro shelo arve, etc., that you're not allowed to do so. Then the Mishnah tells us that in the case of of kvasim together with parim, in that case, you're not allowed to mix the yayin of those two karbanos. Again, I'm going to mention parim just to save myself the extra effort of always mentioning the elim. So parim means parim v'elim. And you're not allowed to mix together the nesachim of kvasim with the nesachim of parim. And this is irrelevant to the fact that he had already mixed the flour and the oil previously. Because if you mix the flour and the oil together with that of the kvasim, the carbon is possible. And you'd have to replace it with new soles and new shemen. So again, even though the even though there was already previous mixing, it would be totally irrelevant because it's possible. Now, at the end of the Mishnah says, you know what? If the ingredients of each mincha was combined separately, before the two menachos were combined and mixed together, then they remain kosher post facto, despite the fact that there's an unequal ratio of ingredients, again, because we're talking about kvasim and parim. Nevertheless, at this point, we can mix the wines together in the nesachim because there's no chashash d'Rabbanan that he might come, to violate the issur of mixing them together because they already had combined and been mixed together. Weiter, v'yenam l'chatchila lo. So Gemara says the following: are you telling me that you're not allowed to mix the wines together l'chatchila if the soles and the shemen had been mixed previously? For Tanya, I have a brisa that says the opposite. So again, l'chatchila, we're not allowed to mix the soles and the shemen. Again, we're talking about parim together with kvasim. But as far as yayin is concerned, we're allowed to mix it even l'chatchila. And that's against Abaye. Elam Abaye. Abaye has to rescind and reinterpret. He says, Hochi Komar. Heicha de Huktar Sultan Vishamnan. The case is where they were already maktir on the Eish of the Mizbeach, the soles and the shemen. And now we finished with the menachos. All we're left with is the nesachim. Is then ma'arvin yayin l'chatchila. That's what the brisa means when it says aval yayin ma'arvin, but only because it was already burnt. The soles together with the shemen was already burnt on the mizbeach. But if, like in our Mishnah, where he hadn't yet been maktir that mixture of soles and shemen, then in this arvu sultan v'shamnon, then ma'arvim nami yenam. If they had already mixed the shemen and the soles together, then l'chatchila you'd be allowed to mix together the nesachim. But in lav, if they hadn't yet mixed together the soles and the shemen, then ein ma'arvim. Why dilma asil aruve soles v'shemen l'chatchila, which is prohibited l'chatchila. Now the Mishnah says keves haboy ma'omer, even though the mincha is double to Shnei Esronim, unlike uh, every other mincha, which is only one isaron. But nevertheless, the nesachim are not doubled. It always will be a revius hahin. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Brisa, uminchaso Shnei Esronim. Right, that the mincha of Kivsei HaOmer is a double mincha of two esron. Limin al keves haba im HaOmer sheminchasu kfula. Yachal kshem sheminchasu kfula kach yeno kaful. Talmud lomer vinisko. We'll see how we darshan this. Rabbi Lezer is going to explain this. Yain, revius hayin. So it's only revius hayin, even though it's two esronim. Yachal lo yehe yeno kaful. I can understand that we don't double the nesachim, and it remains revius hahin she'eno nivlal im minchasa, because we don't mix the wine. The wine is brought separately. You pour it on the shitin. Aval yehei shamno kafel, but the shemen, which is mixed together with the flour, and the flour is now upgraded double to Shnei Esronim. Maybe the shemen should be double, and it should, instead of revius hahin, it should be twice that amount. Tamulon v'nisko kol nechasav lo yuel revius. It always remains a revius hahin, whether we're talking about the yayin and sachim or we're talking about the shemen that's added to the solus. It's always going to remain revius hahin. My Talmud, how do we see this in the pasuk? Omer Rabbi Lazar, ksiv v'niska, v'karinan v'nisko. There's a ksiv and a kri. And we read it as if it said v'nisko with a vav at the end. Ketzad. How do we justify the difference between v'niska in the feminine and v'nisko in the masculine? Niska de mincha kinisko de yayin. Now, the word v'niska here is referring to the shemen. And the shemen should be like the yayin. Ma yayin revius hahin, is af shemenami revius hahin, and we don't double the shemen, even though the soles is doubled to two esronim. Rabbi Yochanan, okay, this is a new sugya. Asham mitzor sheshchato shalo lishma ton nesachim she'imi et ha'omer kem psalto. Now, let's talk a little bit about Asham mitzora. Asham mitzora, unlike any other korban asham, requires nesachim. Now, if the shechita of the Asham mitzora was shalol lishma, the halacha is that the korban is kosher. Ve'eno ol l'baylam shechova, the baylam will have to replace the Asham. And if I remember correctly, the Asham mitzora is necessary to complete his purification, his tahara. But now he shechted shalol lishma. What's going to happen? An Asham Mitzora, to be defined as an Asham Mitzora, as a unique korban Asham, and maintain its identity, must have Nisachim. Otherwise, it looks like another korban Asham. There are many types of korban Asham, but they don't have Nisachim. So now you want to be makriv this korban after the Shechita V'Shalol Lishma, because the korban is still kosher, but it's kosher as an Asham Mitzora, says Rabbi Yochanan, therefore you have to bring the Nesachim. We're not interested in the fact that the Mitzora is going to have to replace this korban with another korban. That's irrelevant. We want to know about the korban itself, and the korban itself needs Nesachim, because that identifies it as an Asham Mitzora. Now what we'll see soon as we go along is that Okay, let's say you didn't bring the nesachim, and the shechita was shelo lishma. Why not turn it into a karban ola? But the answer is that an asham could never become a karban ola. So this asham could only be kosher b'toras asham mitzora, and therefore it requires nesachim. Maskif lo Rav Menashe bar Gado elo me'ata. If you're going with that logic, meaning we have to salvage the karban, even though the shechita was shelo lishma, is keves haba ima omer sheshchato shelo lishma. Now we have something unique with regard to the keves that accompanies the omer, and that is that the mincha has two esronim, a double volume of fine flour. Is now, if he shechted the keves shelo lishma, is according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, tehei mincha kfula, we're going to have to bring a double mincha of two esronim. Shiat omer kain. If you don't agree, then psalto, it's going to be possible. And not only that, says Rabbi Menashe, tamid shel shachar sheshchato shelo lishma. The tamid of shachar is very unique because it requires, after you finish the avoda and the aktor of the tamid shel shachar, you require shnei gizrei eitzim. Is he a ton shnei gzir b'koin echad, or yeah, I'm going to skip a little bit. V'tamid shel ben arbaim shchato shel lishma. Is he going to require two shnei gzir shnei kohanim? So the tamid shel shachar requires shnei gzrei eitzim through one kohen. The tamid shel ben arbaim requires shnei gizrei eitzim with two kohanim, and we're going to have to do this because otherwise, psalto shimi atomer ke psalto, because this is what defines the karban tamid. It's got to have shnei gizrei eitzim. And the Gemara says Einochinami. That's exactly what Rabbi Yochanan would say. So if Rabbi Yochanan would say all this, why didn't he say it all this? Says Abaye, he only mentioned one case, and we would extrapolate the principle that underlies the din in that one case, and we apply it elsewhere to the kvasim that come with the omer, or to the shnei tmidim, as far as bringing it with shnei gizrei eitzim and a kohen and two kohen and so forth and so on. But Rava disagrees with Abaye. Very often, I often think to myself, like, who's greater, Abaye or Rava? We always pass it like Rava. In this case, Rava, mamash outsmarts Abaye. I'm so impressed by the brilliance of this statement of Rava. I don't understand why Abaye didn't come up with it, but we'll see. I do have an explanation for Abaye, but the logic of Rava is brilliant, very powerful. Bishlei mahanach olos ninhu. With regard to the kvasim that accompany the omer, and with regard to the tmidim that we bring shachar ubein arbayim, if those karbanos were shechted shelo lishma, then we could redirect those karbanos to become what's called olas nidava.